Okay, guys, so I'm not sure exactly what happened there, but I got cut off. So we're going to finish the rest of this one slide and then finish the next slide, and we'll be done for the night. And you guys can relax for the rest of the weekend and get your primary source document analyses done and get your summaries done for the weekend, so that way you guys can get credit for them. Yay! So let me pull this back up here. Oh, that's the wrong one. That's next week's. Shoot, I think I closed it. Just a second, guys. Here we go. I've got it now. Sorry, guys, I'm not very tech savvy, so you guys get to witness my technological struggles at their best. So let's see. We are at the Warhawks. So like I said, Henry Clay grows up being a lawyer, a planter, and a statesman. He becomes Secretary of State under President Adams. But one thing that it's important for you guys to know is that the Secretary of State is kind of the stepping stone position to get into the presidency. So for many of us these days, we think of the vice presidentship as the stepping stone position to becoming the president. It's not like that at this point. At this point, it's the Secretary of State who's more likely to become the president. So Henry Clay ran for president 5 times, and he's not ever elected for any of those, ever. The poor guy ends up spending a ton of money and a ton of work trying to get into the presidency, and he's never elected. But on the other hand, he does co-found the Whig Party. And what the Whig Party does is that they are in opposition of Jacksonian politics at a time of increased political interest. What I mean by that is that politics is the entertainment of the day. So, granted, books are great, but all the books being published at this time are highly politicized. It's kind of like in a modern equivalent where everyone's talking about Facebook and Twitter and things like that. That's what politics is right now. And this kind of highly politicized era that we've got going on, based around our current president and our current politics, those are the same kinds of conversations that they're having at this point over, the president, his cabinet, kind of what's going on in government, because all of those are going to play a role in not only the War of 1812, but as time goes on and progresses into the Civil War and beyond. So he advocates for the rule of law in unchanging constitutions and minority protections. And the thing about that is that he wants to take a look at the Constitution and say, this is what the Constitution says, and this is how it can be applied during this situation. So it's not necessarily giving the same kind of context to the Constitution, but still using the words of the Constitution as his basis for law. Like I said a little earlier, he's later known as the Great Compromiser. But that's really as we're getting closer to the Civil War that he kind of adopts that persona. He's one of the few slaveholders in all of the South who frees all of his slaves in his will. And as we move closer to the Civil War, we'll see that this is actually outlawed, so it makes it a little harder to do. But he's one of those few people who actually free all of his slaves in his will. And, before we judge him too harshly on the fact that he had slaves, one thing that it's important for you guys to understand is that, yes, slavery is bad, but at this point in time, it wasn't held with the same kinds of perceptions as it is today. a huge portion of the United States, and the rest of the world for that matter, were slaveholders. And not all of them were black. Prisoners of war were often made into slaves. Um, like here in the U.S., African Americans, or excuse me, Africans, straight from Africa, were made into slaves. Anybody who had become a debtor became essentially a slave of the government, and had to do like different kinds of works to repay their debts and things like that. And we've already talked about indenturement and how that's a little different from slavery, but it still follows the same kinds of concepts. So, this isn't something at this point that is abnormal for society. It just becomes less and less tolerable as time goes on. So, as we move into the War of 1812, there's a call for troops for the War of 1812. And Kentucky's most strategic part in the War of 1812 is in the contribution of sharpshooters. And these are generally people who have come from the border areas. They're people who have skills in hunting, fishing, trapping, things like that. Things where a gun and being able to kill something is the difference between eating and not eating, as opposed to more agrarian parts of society, say in North Carolina or Virginia or someplace like that. So now on to this last slide. Yay, last slide. And this one's going to be really short. And all this is going to be is just a kind of brief overview of the rest of the War of 1812. And I think we're going to move on just a little bit from this. But you need to know that there are considered to be 3 theaters of war for the War of 1812. I separated it into 4 just because I think it makes more sense that way. The first is the Northwestern region, which really deals with Michigan Territory, Indiana, Illinois. Excuse me, guys. I lied to you. I am going to cough some more. And these deal with mostly issues on the Great Lakes areas and invasions of Canada and our attempts to take Canada and to mitigate Native American attacks in the Northwest Territory. You have New Orleans that becomes a battlefront in the South, but it's really just New Orleans. You have some attacks in the Atlantic from the British, and then the Chesapeake area, which is where we see the burning of the White House and the British eating dinner in the White House prior to burning it. This is where the iconic image of Dolly Madison saving George Washington's portrait comes into play. It's kind of a neat story. Dolly Madison kind of stays behind to pack up the house while her husband runs away, and then she follows after and has saved George Washington's portrait, which is kind of a funny imagery. And you'd think it should be backwards, but Dolly Madison was kind of like, nope, I'm going to do this. And she's a real socialite of her time, so if that's something you think you'd be interested in, it might make for a good primary source document analysis if you can find anything on it. And then from there, you have the Battle of Baltimore, which leads to the writing of the Star-Spangled Banner by Francis Scott Key. And it's actually put to the tune of a drinking song, so that one might be a fun primary source document analysis, if you can figure out what that drinking song is. So good luck. Enjoy the rest of your weekend, and I will see you guys next week. Thank you so much. Bye.